I love the fact that Vietnam and Vietnamese history and language is being pushed in the schools. But just standing on the other side and being devil's advocate, why do we get this privilege of pushing our narrative in the public schools here in Southern California so much?
Welcome to The Vietnamese. I'm your host, Kenneth Nguyen. Being part of a culture of nearly 100 million Vietnamese people in the world today comes with a lot of pain, proud history, and privilege. Join me as I highlight and explore the Vietnamese experience from all over.
We are on the part 2 right now, and I want to start to ask you about your journey into the dual language immersion program in Orange County. And then the second part of this will get into how curriculums are written.
Going back to what I was talking about as a college student, talking about how I was so inspired by, for the first time connecting with my community through my Vietnamese language classes and Vietnamese American classes too. I think those are really important because the Vietnamese language classes gave me a cultural connection to my community, things that I knew, and a way into what I call old people, a way into understanding my parents' generation. At the same time, I also took a Vietnamese American class with a distinguished professor. Her name is Nguyễn, and she completely changed the way I view the Vietnamese American community. Because, I was from Little Saigon. Everything that I know about Vietnamese American is basically we are refugees from war. We are the proud, Republic of Vietnam, whatever. That's all I knew. We're an anti-communist community. We're refugees. That's the most of what I knew. And then when I took this Vietnamese American class at UCLA, I was just blown away by how much I did not know about, the possibilities of going deeper into the community. For example, gender issues. How do gender issues change when, women, come to America? They have jobs, and how do husbands, when they lost everything, they were big in Vietnam, they come here and they're just menial workers. Nail salons. Why do nail salons in the US, 80% of them are owned by Vietnamese Americans? That passed straight from the first days in 1975 when local American celebrity trained 6 Vietnamese refugees, and they became the first ever, Vietnamese nail salon people. Little things, even like how community organizing works, and how, let's say, Louisiana became the place with the first ever Vietnamese American movement. These were all fascinating things to me, that I didn't know before. And with that kind of fascination about when I realized I do a lot for the community and learn more, I applied for a master's, specifically in ethnic studies. But I didn't get into a lot of the ethnic studies programs. And I got an opportunity to study Vietnamese studies at Columbia University. And, I took it because it was a very good opportunity. It was during COVID, and I really just wanted to learn more. I don't know why I wanted to just go, lose everything in my life and just go straight to Vietnamese studies. But I just felt that there was so much more to learn that I didn't have at UCLA. UCLA is one of the centers of Southeast Asia, but then they only had one Vietnamese American class. And so I was like, there's so much more. I just don't know where I'm getting it from. So I went all the way to Columbia, and it was there for the first time that I really went deep into Vietnamese and Vietnamese American history, Vietnamese history especially. I studied, there's a book, it's one of the standard books if you want to know about Vietnamese history. It's called History of the Vietnamese by Keith Taylor. So I read Keith Taylor. It was, I didn't know anything about Vietnamese history before 1975. And I didn't even know anything after 1975 because I just know we're refugees. But then I studied all the way from the beginnings of Nông Sơn culture and the beginnings of Vietnamese civilization to 4,000, 5,000 years later to literally, intricacies about the Vietnam being split into North and South, and then the Vietnamese refugee diaspora. And at Columbia, I really got an appreciation for all of these different aspects of transnational history. Because at UCLA, we are very Asian American focused. We see there are 2 important schools of thought into Vietnamese and Vietnamese American studies. The first is the Asian American studies field, which is limited in its own way. So this would be people like Vietnam Win and Le Espiritu, etc., who place Asian Americans as part of a broader study and social context of people of color. And the framework behind people of color and the ethnic studies movement came out of lack of representation and challenging colonial narratives about people of color. And so there is Asian American studies is baked into challenging colonialism, challenging imperialism, and giving voice to people of color, specifically Asian Americans in that field. One of the things, the limitations of that is that for Vietnamese Americans, the Vietnamese American experience very much starts at the beginning of 1975. And so a lot of what happens before 1975 is ignored because of the language barrier. Most of these people who are in studying this do not speak Vietnamese. And so they physically can't access anything before 1975, but more so because they're part of a broader sphere of challenging colonialism, imperialism. The second school of thought is Vietnamese studies, Vietnamese American studies in the context of transnational history, in the context of area studies, which is people like Tường Vũ, Alex Tai Vo, Diệu Vương, etc. And these people do not they it's not like they challenge the anti-imperialist kind of people of color focus of Asian American studies, but people in Asian studies tend to situate Vietnamese Americans in the context of where they came from. So you cannot, someone like Alex Tai Vo would argue that, you cannot understand Vietnamese Americans unless you understand all the intricacies of, the conflict of North Vietnam and South Vietnam and republicanism and the culture within, rather than focusing on social justice movements and focusing on it and representation and gender roles in America after 1975. That's what Asian Americans tend to do. And I'm one of the few people who got to see both sides because UCLA was a very Asian American focused, like type of thing and, type of field. And I remember before I went to Columbia, type of people who were, very close to like people like Vietnam Win. Vietnam Win was like, he came to my school and he spoke and I was like, oh my God, he's so, so amazing, so inspiring. Then I went to Columbia and I saw these same Vietnamese American studies people and they said things like, oh, Thanh Nguyen is a fraud. He is one of the worst ever, scholars for Vietnamese American studies. And I was like, what the heck? But I realized that because these two schools of thoughts, both of these schools of thoughts fascinated me because they gave me a very broad understanding of the field that I feel like most people in Asian American, Vietnamese American studies don't have because they only studied one or the other. And after I finished, because I learned so much, answering a question about dual immersion, I had so much information and I wanted to go back into my community where if you ask the average Little Saigon person, even the people who lived through the war, keep in mind actual refugees, they don't know the stuff that I knew. So I read Keith Taylor and, that basically I read from the beginning of Vietnamese history, like the Dong Sang culture, Hai Bát Dung, everything, all the way to, the 1960s and 70s where they're talking about the Vietnam War, North and South, and even modern society today, which nobody really talks about, let's say Doi Mới reforms, Vietnam market reforms in 1986, and what politics is like today in Vietnam right now. I learned 4,000 years of history, and it really gave me an appreciation of Vietnamese American studies in the context of Vietnamese history. And I learned so much stuff. And I also learned it in a really unique way because I come from UCLA and the Vietnamese American studies at UCLA and / Asian American studies belongs to a very particular school of thought. And that is the Asian American studies field. I have to make a distinction. Asian American studies as a discipline is unique in its own right. Versus at Columbia University, I was in Asian studies, not necessarily Asian American studies. And so I was learning things from not an ethnic studies perspective, which focuses on the voices of marginalized people in America, but of people around the world and how they are situated in the context of their geopolitical context in, let's say, Vietnam or China or Japan. And so uh, there are two kind of schools of thought when we talk about Vietnamese American studies. The first is Asian American studies, like I said, and Asian American studies sees Vietnamese Americans, their discipline, all academic disciplines have a way of thought, a particular way of thought. And so Asian American studies studies Vietnamese Americans um, from in the context that they are part of a larger group of people of color. And the ethnic studies slash Asian American studies movement came out because these people were challenging, white colonialist narratives about people of color that did not happen in the 1970s. And so college students demanded that their own histories be taught. And so because of that, when you put Asian American slash Vietnamese American into the context of people of color, you put them into a broader context of fighting colonialism, fighting imperialism, and fighting their injustices and fighting back against injustices that happen in America, and especially in America. Asian studies is a bit different. Asian studies, one of the limitations of Asian American studies is that in Asian American studies, they tend to view Vietnamese American studies as, their journey begins when they come to America. So for Vietnamese Americans, that's 1975 onwards. So they talk about nail salons, they talk about organizing, they talk about politics in the community, and a very little reference to, anything that came in Vietnam. One, because Asian American scholars tend to not speak Vietnamese or the languages of China, Korea, and Vietnamese, because that's not part of their training. Their training is in these broader sociological concepts. And so,
can I stop you there, Joseph?
yeah, sure.
Isn't those parameters for the Asian American professor, researcher, scholar, isn't that suffice to start their starting point from an Asian American starting point, and they don't need to go beyond it? I'm just making a devil's advocate argument here for professors like Vetan Win or Inle Espiritu that you brought up, that if we're just talking about Asian American studies, that's all we need to talk about is the point of 1975 onward. Now, if we go broader, because, I know the sentiment of probably the professors that you study with at Columbia feels like that's not enough, but isn't it sort of like enough because we're just talking about this particular context?
Yes and no. I think that Asian American studies offer something very, very important. So I'm not bashing Asian American studies scholars at all. When I came from UCLA, Viet Nguyen and Le Espiritu, my own professor, Nguyễn, they were people that I adored. These were the people that trained me. I come from that background. And I really, the way I see the Vietnamese American community even now is very much shaped on how do they exist in the broader imperialist context of the U.S. empire, et cetera. And the no part comes from a lot of the things that they're missing, that runs through the gaps. But Asian Americanists also acknowledge it. So I didn't really explain in this recording about the other school of thought at Columbia, which is Asian Studies, which is viewing Vietnamese Americans. So Asian American Studies is professors like Inle Espiritu from UCSD, Viet Win, USC,
What to Hung, you said?
Nguyen Ba Tu Hung, UCLA, people like there's a lot of Vietnamese American professors, but those are some of the big names. And in Asian Studies, some of the big names are Alex Tai Vo, Đường Vũ, Diệu Vương. These are Asian studies people. So they focus primarily on Vietnam history, not Vietnamese American history. But when they study Vietnamese Americans, they study Vietnamese Americans in the context of who were Vietnamese Americans before 1975 in North Vietnam. What hometown did they come from? Were they educated? What was their class? In the history of Vietnam War. And so this is why Asian American studies at universities tends to, relate more to young people, the way that young people see their point of America as Americans first.
Hmm.
Right? Not, I don't like the word as Americans first, because even in Asian American studies, we talk about how identity is fluid and there's a lot of people people come to grips with who they are, but especially in the American context. Asian studies views Vietnamese Americans in the Vietnamese context, which means that it relates to a lot of older people who don't really see themselves in the American context, and they constantly think about things that go on in Vietnam and their past in Vietnam. And they say, people like Thầy Võ says very clearly that Asian American studies up until now and Vietnamese American studies is a bit limited because they don't take into account all of these other factors in the context of Vietnam as a whole. I'm one of the few kind of scholars, I guess, who got to be who got to do a lot of research in both fields. Very few scholars, even distinguished professors, don't get to do that. And I learned so much important information that, I related to older and younger generations. And I thought about, what can I do with all this? And it was at that time when I was thinking about quitting academia, because there's so many issues with academia, such as not being able to find a job in and having an impact of writing a book and only 20 people might read it in your life. And so I wanted to take all this information, and I asked myself, how do I show this to my community? Because I lived in Little Saigon, and even the people that lived through the war and came to America, they don't know these things about how nail salons were formed, because they're part of the history. They're not the history studiers. And so many young people too who don't even know what the Vietnam War is. So um and the best way that I found to to share that information was through education. And so there were two initiatives that made me wanted to leave academia and go into education.
Let me stop you again right there. And we'll go back to these two things that led you into academia or stop. So this whole idea of Tường Vũ, Alex Thầy Võ, and Espiritu and Vetan Win being from these different camps. And I'm not asking you to speak for Vetan Win or, any of these Asian American professors, but do you think that if push came to shove and we challenged Vetan Win, do you think he would say all that stuff that Tường Vũ and Alex is doing doesn't matter, and what matters to me as Vetan Win is 1975 moving forward? Do you think he would discount like any prior, or do you think he'd be like, yeah, all of that is important, but that's just not what I'm focused on?
I don't think he would discount it at all, because we all kind of share the same sense for the Vietnamese American community. But you can tell there's there's definitely a lot of tea in academia, and the biggest tea that I found as a scholar comes from how do we view Vietnamese Americans from these different camps. And so I've had a professor, he was at Columbia, a very distinguished professor. He teaches at Dartmouth University now, and he basically in class he went on a 15-minute rant saying Viet Nguyen is the most direct intellectual in the history of whatever, and he doesn't understand. Everything that he says is bullshit, and etc. And
This was
for
a
me,
Vietnamese
coming from UCLA, where Viet Thanh Nguyen is like,
god.
an idol to Asian Americans and Vietnamese, especially young Vietnamese Americans, I was like, what the heck are you saying? And
And this was a Vietnamese professor?
this is a professor of Vietnamase studies, yes. So
Wait, was he a white person or was it a Vietnamese person?
he was Chinese actually, but Vietnamese studies has a lot more, non-Vietnamese people who study it because they're studying Vietnamese history. Vietnamese American studies, because of in general, Asian American ethnic studies as, people of color, teaching people of color to remember the histories of people of color. There's less of that because there's more of like a solidarity between people of color, where in Asian studies, it's more like a discipline. So you have some people who are like, oh, I'm interested in the Vietnam War, I'm going to get a PhD on it. Less people, less white people go into Asian American studies and say, oh, I just love people from Little Saigon. And so I'm going to, research about, how Vietnamese Americans find allyship against in the imperialist context or the U.S. empire. There are definitely intersections between the two, but yeah, in Asian studies, there's a lot more white people, a lot more non-Vietnamese people.
But it's crazy because I think I've heard this sort of rivalry from the East Coast attacking like the West Coast way of looking at it.
Yes.
But it's not even as East and West really. But I never heard the attack coming from the Vietnam Win camps or the Spiritu camps going back the other way. I just don't hear it.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I'm like outside of the ballpark, or I
I
don't.
think
I'm not that world, but
I think there is some tension in the sense that, um, you know, it's a lot of pushing back on traditional ways of thinking. And especially if you're from an ethnic studies camp and you view Vietnamese Americans in the context of the struggles of people of color, then um, you have very strong views on, let's say, Vietnamese Americans as victims of U.S. aggression and imperialism in the War of Vietnam that led to their state of being refugees in the United States, for example. That is something that they would very strongly advocate for and disagree with. Whereas, a lot of the people in the history camp / Asian studies camp would very much be against, many of them are more conservative in that sense politically, they would very much be against the idea, and many older generations too, of, of Vietnamese refugees or Vietnamese people in the context of U.S. imperialism, which has a very left-leaning stream. And so definitely Vetan Win, on his posts and stuff, he constantly challenges, I don't want to say Asian studies types of views, but he constantly challenges traditional views that older Vietnamese Americans have had about Vietnamese Americans and the Vietnam War, and he places it in a new context. This was actually his biggest academic contribution. It wasn't The Sympathizer, it wasn't, his movie, but what he did for the academic field was that he changed the way Vietnamese Americans are talked about in academia, because before that, Vietnamese Americans were always an anomaly. They were always like, we are refugees from a war. We're refugees from a war, but also we came from a war in which other people of color, protested because they didn't want their, black and brown bodies going to Vietnam and dying in the war. And and we were always like, we're people of color, but at the same time, we're not, quote unquote. And there was always that kind of weird tension between conservative Vietnamese Americans who are very loyal to their country, who did not like being told that, you're just a pawn of imperialists of the U.S. empire, or a lot of it comes from from other factors. And so, Viet Nguyen was the first person to create one of the, I don't want to say the first person, but he was one of the first people who popularized the argument that Vietnamese refugees, they are refugees and proud refugees because of American intervention in Vietnam, and not because of communism. And this is a very new way of thinking about it. And for Vietnamese Americans who are always kind of unsteady about where they find themselves in terms of other spaces of color, and as well as other Asian American spaces, a lot of young people related to that a lot more than the traditional narrative of, we escaped communism, we need to, fight for human rights and democracy in Vietnam, and to be proud of being American. And Viet Thanh Nguyen definitely vehemently criticizes a lot of those traditional viewpoints and why.
I mean, we can argue that Viet Thanh Nguyen is saying whatever communism is, it's doing its job. It kicked the invaders out, and we, the refugee community in America, is here because the United States intervened in Vietnam, and that's why we're here. Is that what you're saying?
Very close. Yes. So yes, he's not a full-throated supporter of communism. Obviously, he has a lot of criticisms about communism, but yes, he focuses. Usually, people say, "Oh, the Vietnam War is a civil war on both sides." This is what Asian studies people would say, of people with very different beliefs on how they want a Vietnamese nation to be. Those are communists. Those are nationalists. Those are who follow republicanism, and they fought, and due to many historical factors, they eventually lost. And they came to the U.S. and they started new lives. Someone from an ethnic studies camp would say something to the effect that Vietnam, ever since French colonial period, has been a victim of colonization and imperialism from the West, and the American war in Vietnam is simply an extension of a fight between the people of self-determination, fighting for self-determination, and American interests in the region. In the end, the presence of Vietnamese refugees, even their presence of Vietnamese refugees, is meant to be a statement against communism. It's supposed to serve the U.S. empire and the narrative of the U.S. empire savior of different nations, different peoples around the world, and it keeps kind of the supremacy of the U.S. empire and its exploitation of other colonies around the world in the U.S. narrative. And Enlai Espiritu creates this big narrative. It's called "We Win Even." This concept that we win even when we lose. That even when America lost the actual war, they won the war in memory and culture, where everything about around the world talks about the Vietnam War, focuses on American soldiers and focuses on the American experience in saving Vietnam from communism, even when they lost. And like Vietnam won the war, but even if you look around most around the world, most people will subscribe to the idea of Americans who came into Vietnam and with an ideal of saving refugees from communism, and Vietnamese refugees are a clear example of people being saved from communism and the issues of communism today, etc. So I'm gonna stop rambling a little bit there because I get really deep into this.
No, I love it actually, Joseph, because this is something that is not spoken about enough. And I know that, we're in the weeds, but like, where else are we going to talk about this stuff? And I'm interested in this kind of stuff and hearing about it in a lecture, or you might think it's rambling, but I don't think it's rambling at all. I think that I could dedicate a whole like 9 hours to just listening to, because look, all of this relates to how I am being treated in the world, in America, in the world, in my Vietnamese American family, and in the world of my family in Vietnam when I'm in Vietnam. It all makes sort of like, it all allows me to triangulate in a healthy way. And I hope it allows other people that are my age who are kind of like, for the first time going into this forest and not really understanding there's distinctions that are happening when we don't know about it. There's this academic world that's all being broken down to the subtleties. And I think being aware of all the subtleties is very important. So,
Yeah.
But I know you want to move on, and I'm okay with that. But I just want to let you know it's very important to talk about these things, because where else are people going to talk about it?
Yeah.
Cool. Let's go to the 2 points that you said, the reason why you wanted to depart academia.
Oh yeah, so I got really disillusioned with academia, just the hierarchical structure and the impact that I wanted to make. I really respect people in academia, actually, as a person. As someone who is in academia, I've met people who every single day, instead of watching Netflix, instead of, playing sports, every single day they're just constantly reading random esoteric books that they found in the library at 2 a.m. Reading during dinner and then writing for fun, just writing all of their intellectual thoughts. And because some of these thoughts don't get in a happy published paper, they just post on Facebook, and so they write like 6-page long essays just on Facebook about their thoughts. So I really respect them, but I was realizing more and more that life wasn't for me. Because when I thought about professor before I came to graduate school, I was kind of like, I just want to learn more. And I thought being a professor was like, doing interviews with like Washington Post and, being an expert in your field where you influence the way people think, which is very true. But the impact usually goes from you write a book, maybe 20, 30 other professors read that book, and then they now understand it. And that might be your legacy. And some of that trickles down to, let's say, an HBO movie or like a way or a common discourse on the ground, but not much. And so I wanted to have a more direct impact. And so there were two initiatives in California that really wanted me to see how do I get all of this information that I had the privilege of learning to the actual community that I live in, where most people don't know about it. And education was the big thing. So the first initiative in education is the ethnic studies requirement that is actually coming out next year in 2025 in California. Starting in 2025, every single high school has to offer an ethnic studies class. That is a class focusing on either African Americans, Native Americans, Latino, Chicano Americans, or Asian Americans. And by the class of 2029, so the class that comes in for 2025 has to take that class to graduate high school. That's crazy because when I went and I took US history classes, there's like 2 lines on the Vietnam War. They're not on Vietnamese Americans, maybe like a page or 2 about the Vietnam War, right? And now you have a whole class on it, whole semester class on it. And so with that requirement, there's a lot more to be done on how to teach high schoolers on that on a broad socio, state level for all of the new generation who did not get understandings that me and you got. We were used to being minorities, but now we can actually learn our own histories. So I had a lot of passion for that. The second initiative was dual immersion programs, and this started, about 10 years ago too, with the repealing of Proposition 56 and allowing bilingual education in the U.S. That teaching everything 50% in Vietnamese and 50% English from kindergarten to high school. Science, social studies, and math. And so now that if we can teach our Vietnamese American history, we can also teach our language and culture, and we can create a new generation where, you can come into kindergarten not knowing anything, and you're 3rd generation, 4th generation, graduate high school, your language, your culture, your history, all of that, fully fledged member. You're not a Vietnamese, you don't learn Vietnamese history, as a Vietnamese person. You don't learn American history as an American person, but specifically fitting your identity as a Vietnamese American person or a person of color, which I think is a really ambitious and a really admirable vision for the future of California. And so I wanted to go and contribute to that.
So when did you learn about these initiatives, and when did California actually start doing these initiatives, and who led them?
Yes. So I think the ethnic studies law was constantly being debated as I was in grad school. So like 2020, 2021, I think it eventually got passed in 2021 for the first class to start in 2025. So in that time in between that is a really critical time, even now, for all the school districts in California to basically say, how do we do this new law? How do we change our whole curriculum to, create a class based on the history of marginalized peoples in America? And that discussion, it is now a new source of politics, because you'll have conservative districts who will be like, I don't want to change anything. It's a waste of money and I don't believe in it anyways. And so I'm just going to get that, white U.S. history teacher who's been teaching U.S. history for 40 years, and I'm going to have him teach ethnic studies.
Yeah.
And obviously he doesn't know anything about the Asian American experience besides like Japanese internment camps. And so it becomes a very whitewashed version of history. At the same time, you'll have some more districts who want to pounce on that, and they will decide to, create a whole year-long course and focusing on all these different ethnic groups. And some, districts having an Asian American specific class or an African American Studies specific class, like the SAT College Board is creating an AP African American Studies class, right? So there are avenues for that. And being in the center of that politics means who's going to create the curriculum? I want to help create some of that curriculum. In California, they also passed a $5 million law giving money to fund the first ever Vietnamese American model curriculum, Vietnamese American Experiences model curriculum, which is coming out this fall, which is 1,000 pages of everything from, let's say, the fall of Saigon to Republic of Vietnam to LGBTQ issues in the Vietnamese American community, to mental health, to how Little Saigon was built in America, all of that just for high school level. And I was very happy to work on that for the past 3 years. So I've been working on the past 3 years to help make 1,000 pages of curriculum, lesson plans for teachers, and with the hope that maybe these lessons will be used in the future when these ethnic studies classes become graduation requirements for even some districts like, Garden Grove, which is predominantly Vietnamese.
So did you get paid to do that for the last 3 years, or was it voluntary?
Yes, I got paid. So like short-term work through the
state of
Orange County
California?
Department of Education. Yeah, so state of California, and for the Vietnamese Americans experience specifically, they assigned it to the Orange County Department of Education. And so yeah, I worked as a short-term curriculum writer for Orange County Department of Education for the past
How
3
did
years.
you hear about the job opening? I mean, all of this is so interesting to me because it's like all of this is going on in the back in behind the scenes, but it's like, how do people get notified that, we're working on this project, we need writers for the curriculum? Hey, Joseph, like, how does this transpire?
I don't want to go really too long into this because it's mainly just when you're in the field of education, which I was doing to get my teaching credential, and you're in the field of you're just connected to the Vietnamese community. Like I found out about that job, a lot of this just by hearing hearsay. So just people talking about certain things and asking if I wanted to join. And I was like, okay, yeah.
And I ask about it because it's like, if I was a conservative person putting this curriculum together, I would just be like, I'm going to go find my own people who doesn't believe in critical race theory, or who doesn't believe, who can water this down as best as they can and just do the bare minimum. Why would I go find somebody like you who really understands this stuff? And you know what I mean? It's like, I wonder about like hiring, who is putting the flavoring and the spices on the people who are writing this curriculum for the OC Department of Education.
It's interesting that you mentioned critical race theory because that is the predominant political debate that happens in California about why so many people did not want ethnic studies, because so many people were just like, oh, ethnic studies is basically just a cover for people to teach people to hate America, and talk about how we were racist, right? But, I think the Vietnamese American experience in ethnic studies is a really good example of how it's not like that. Literally, you're teaching people the history of how many people went through war and they escaped communism and they came to the US and they started a new life there. It's not very much, it's not like the
Opposite of that.
rhetoric that you see around ethnic studies. There's definitely spaces where that is being advocated for. So
that now, do you see why it's important to ask a question like, how did you get hired? Because
yeah,
I want to know who is figuring this stuff out, like at that level, right? Like, how do you hear about this? Because how you hear about it is important, because then who are the applicants that are applying to this? Who's the teams that are writing this stuff? Because I think, like, if I think about Texas or I think about the South, I'm like, there's no way that this is happening.
yeah, and it could happen, really depending on the rhetoric that you do for it, because the person who actually got the funding for the Vietnamese American Studies curriculum was actually Republican. Her name was Janet Nguyen. She's the one who helped pass the law. But at the same time, when we making this curriculum, we're making it in a way that it's academically focused on the Vietnamese American experience and not trying to sway, a political persuasion in. Ethnic studies at the college level is very political, but less so at the high school level. And California specifically did this in order to be inclusive for all of its different groups in California.
Got it. Okay, now let's get into the curriculum that you wanted to get into.
Yeah. Do you have a question on that, or?
Yeah. Of course, I have questions. So, how do we know where the parameters are when we're talking curriculum writing? How is it, that you introduce things that are very far progressive, very conservative? How do the team that builds these curriculums know where the boundaries are?
So, first off, there's a director, Orange County Department of Education, that heads all of this, and her name is Marika Manos, Dr. Marika Manos, and she's the one who is in charge of outreaching everyone. And she did a really good job because she created a team that was she created three teams: a writing team for teachers, a a research team which is made of professors like Alex Taival and Deng Wu, and she made a community team which is made of members of the community, both the younger and older generations, that are able to share their input. That's a really important structural thing that she did.
Strategy.
Yeah, because it really could have ended up like I'm just gonna get my, best friends at the top, 60-year-old people, 70-year-old, and just, write like communism is the worst type of traditional narrative by the Vietnamese American community. But they wanted it to be research based. She wanted it to be everything research based. And so she takes the direction of many scholars like Alex Taival and Inlay Spiritu is on that committee too, right? So you have Alex Taival and Inlay Spiritu giving their very different opinions on what is important to the Vietnamese American community. That knowledge gets, used to train educators who have lesson writing experience.
Did
And
you
those
see those guys?
educators write the plans.
Did you see those guys fight? Did you see them like argue
No,
about things?
no, I did not see them fight at all. The topics that I talk about in terms of like, debate between those two, they're like academic circles, like at the top level. But no, when you're creating a curriculum together, there is still a strong sense of community. And so they may have different philosophical differences about how to think about something, but no, they both I don't want to make it as if they both hate each other and each side hate each other. They both really respect that the work they're doing, especially Vietnamese Americans on both sides. So people like Alex Taiwan and Les Spiritu, they may view the Vietnam War a bit differently, but they both highly, highly respect each other.
Yeah, I apologize. Sometimes I'm like a ringside commentator, and I just want to see like action in the ring, and I've tried to bring
Oh
it.
no, it's great, and there's definitely some of that there too.
I try to bring it out through your lens, but so it's a little bit like a trade magazine or some gossip magazine, but so I apologize for that. I just want to hear but it's refreshing to know that there's a lot of respect that's happening as these things are being created.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I like that somehow just a local Orange County district was able to find these scholars of all these different political persuasions you know, all over the world slash country and create a really comprehensive Vietnamese American Studies curriculum that respects, both sides of thinking. And this is why we have a whole unit just on the history before 1975, on what colonialism was, what, how to think about the war, Vietnam War, and what are the narratives that are being pushed out, and how to critically think about why these different narratives exist rather than trying to push a particular narrative. And then there's a whole nother curriculum on just community building in America, on things like, race and gender, things like incarceration, and rap music, etc. Yeah.
And is this written for, because I understand that the new cohorts are coming into their freshman ninth grade year, and so is written for the next 4 years of their high school journey?
It's written for one class, one if there was a Vietnamese American Studies class or incorporated into any social studies curriculum.
Oh,
And
so it's only just one class that you guys built around.
yes,
For
and
3 years, this big team wrote for just one class.
They're not writing for a class, but they're creating a number of lesson plans with the units that we plan out that could be used for any individual lesson, let's say for a regular U.S. history class, but can also be used totally for a Vietnamese American Studies class. So yeah, uh, a year's worth of material we really have of all these primary sources, secondary sources of how lesson plans for teachers who may not know anything about Vietnamese American Studies, who can use that to teach it to a group of high school students who may not all be Vietnamese American, um, all aligned to the standards of California. So, um, yeah, there's a lot of good stuff there.
Now,
And the next part is how districts will implement it. And that's all the political side that we'll see what happens in the next few years.
now, why is it important for students in California to learn the history of the Vietnamese?
I think because we have so many Vietnamese here in
Okay,
California.
other than that, what about the other students that are not Vietnamese? What's the case for that?
I think one, first, like I said, that everyone in I think most people in California will at least like meet one Vietnamese American there. And they're, in general, the reason why ethnic studies became passes a law in California was so people from different backgrounds can have a space to not just learn about their own experiences, but to share and empathize with other experiences. And if you look at the California model curriculum, they put empathy as one of the main guiding points of understanding, Vietnamese Americans understanding people from the African American community. There's so much racism in the Vietnamese American community because they don't know anything about the history of Black Americans in America. And they get to benefit a lot by learning about these experiences. And so there's definitely a lot for people to benefit from, especially let's say you live in Orange County. You've been around Vietnamese Americans your whole life, and you just don't know anything about them, and Mexican Americans, Latino Americans, Vietnamese Americans. This is the broader framework of ethnic studies and why ethnic studies in general is so important, because when you give stories to different groups of color, different people of color, then you see people starting to connect with each other in terms of real American history, not the American history that we all came from the revolution and, we for freedom and liberty, but a real type of American history um, that supersedes traditional U.S. history textbooks, in which people can actually talk about history and be like, that was where my parents came from. And I may not be a Vietnamese American, but my parents were refugees, or my parents were immigrants too, and they crossed the river through the border, and I can make that connection with you. And that creates a more equitable society, that creates a more empathetic society, and a true multicultural society, which we're not there yet, but we're still getting there in California.
Yeah. Look, I am apologizing for being a devil's advocate, but I just have to push and I just have to ask. When we think about countries like South Korea with, I don't know, how 30 million, 50 million, I'm not sure. That's clearly half of the size of Vietnam. Or when you think of Indonesia, almost the size of the United States with the population, maybe 285 million. We're talking about triple the size of Vietnam. Why and I trust me, I love the fact that Vietnam and Vietnamese history and language is being pushed in the schools. But just standing on the other side and being devil's advocate, why do we get this privilege of pushing our narrative in the public schools here in Southern California so much?
I think that first of all, that's a really good question. And so even though, since I'm talking about my own experience and what work I'm doing, I'm only focusing on Vietnamese Americans. But for every Vietnamese language, dual language program there is, or people working on Vietnamese American Studies programs, there's people all over the state focusing on Spanish dual immersion programs, which are, the biggest dual immersion programs in America. They're everywhere in California now. There are people working on trying to create Chicano Latino studies courses, Black African American courses. College Board is making AP African American Studies course. They're not making an AP Vietnamese American course, and so that their experiences do matter. And depending on the community, Like in Fresno has the biggest Hmong American community in the world. They're creating a Hmong American Studies curriculum, which fits their community. And in Orange County, we have a different demographic. And so obviously, more kind of Vietnamese related things come up here. And I think that's the beauty of the curriculum, that the law allows that these different classes can be taught in different areas to fit the community that they serve. And there are definitely marginalized groups that are not represented in ethnic studies and are still not represented in ethnic studies in general. So if you teach a general ethnic studies class, you won't see a whole big history on Indonesian Americans, or let's say a lot Arab Americans and stuff, depending on the community, because and a lot of people were against the ethnic studies curriculum because they were like, I want my story in it too. And there's no way you can put every single ex-American into one class and make it a meaningful class. And so those concerns are definitely valid. In the end, the voices that get represented, 40 years ago, Vietnamese Americans were not represented, but Black Americans started getting represented more in, society. Now, Asian Americans are becoming more and more represented. But on the next step, in the future, currently, probably very few people talk about Southeast Asian Americans, or very few people talk about Arab Americans, people from Jordan or Saudi Arabia or Palestine, and Persian Americans who have very different specific histories that are proud of themselves. And those things will also be developed in the future. I know in terms of my part, since I have all this knowledge, I'm focused on, building up the Vietnamese American experience. And that's my little contribution, hopefully, to public knowledge here in California and in general.
Joseph, I look forward to the next few years of your involvement in the Orange County Department of Education system. It looks like you're doing a lot of work, and we've covered a lot of ground today and the last previous session that we sat. I want to thank you so much for coming on, and I want to let everybody know that Joseph and I are working on other projects together. We have worked on other projects inside the film industry together, and I treasure and I value the work and the brain that you bring to the Vietnamese community.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to The Vietnamese with Kenneth Nguyen. Special thanks to Brittany Tran, to Jane Nguyen, Catherine Nguyen, Tina Pham, Sydney Jamie, and Christo Trin. Please find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Vietnamese Podcast.